non-residential buildings, so commercial and industrial facilities.
Tengo el gusto de presentar al doctor Vitor Silva. Él es el coordinador de riesgos de la Fundación Global Earthquake Model, GIM. En la última década ha desarrollado herramientas y modelos necesarios para comprender el impacto de los terremotos a escala local, nacional y regional. Trabaja en los campos de la modelización de peligros sísmicos, la evaluación de riesgos y la estimación de pérdidas. Dr. Silva obtuvo recientemente un premio internacional muy prestigioso al científico joven destacado en el tema de riesgos naturales. La presentación de él ahora es la evaluación del riesgo sísmico global desde la ruptura hasta la recuperación. Y entonces les dejo a ustedes, voy a parar compartir mi pantalla y dejo con ustedes al doctor Vitor Silva.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much for the introduction. Can you confirm that you can see my presentation, please?
Sí, vemos su presentación.
Okay, just a second. Okay. Do you see the right view or the presentation view?
The presentation field.
Okay, so now it should be okay.
At this moment, I'm seeing not only your presentation, but also, yes, now it's only the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I wanted to thank my friend Carlos Villasís, and I'm also very happy to present after my other friend Surya from NSET. This is a relatively small world. For this presentation, I wanted to show some of the activities that are being developed within the global earthquake model with many partners around the world, including NSET, but also including some institutions, some very good friends in Ecuador and in some other parts of Latin America. I named this presentation From Rupture to Recovery because I will talk about the different components. But actually, instead of going from rupture to recovery, I wanted just to show first some ways in which some of these outcomes from the global earthquake model are being used to develop tools and data sets and support initiatives exactly to reduce the risk from earthquakes. Probably for some of you, what I'm presenting here, it's not new, but I just wanted to make sure we're all in the same page. When we're talking about risk, we're talking about the combination between having areas with seismic hazard, so basically areas which are prone to earthquakes and shaking on the ground. They are exposed to, we have exposure, which are in these areas of seismic hazard, exposure, which means buildings, infrastructure, people, economic value. And then the likelihood that these buildings, that this infrastructure might suffer damage or not is represented by the vulnerability component. Before going into the definitions of this, into examples of these three components, I just wanted to give some examples of how risk assessment can be used to inform risk reduction, to develop these risk reduction measures. And I wanted to show just a few examples. For example, an example that I like very much is this one for Italy. After the L'Aquila earthquake, where unfortunately more than 300 people died, the Italian government started a very large program, almost 1 billion euros throughout 7 years. And the way that the Italian government decided to distribute the funds across the country was based on the seismic risk. So basically, regions where we expect higher losses received more funds, and then other regions received less funds. But basically, this can be used to allocate funds, and this is done at the national scale, for example, for this case of Italy, but this is also done at the global scale and at national scale by international organizations like the European Union, for example. This type of information can also be used to build earthquake risk profiles. So basically try to understand exactly in a given country, why do we have earthquake risk? What are the cities with the highest risk? Which are the type of construction that is contributing the most to the risk? Is it the unreinforced masonry? Is it the adobe? Is it reinforced concrete? So all this information can also be taken from earthquake risk profiles. And I'm giving here an example from a risk profile from the World Bank, but GEM has collaborated with the World Bank to develop risk profiles for many other countries. The other tool that is also extremely important, and we've seen this in events like, for example, in Japan or New Zealand, is that earthquake insurance is a very important tool when it comes to recovery. Unfortunately, insurance penetration for earthquakes, and we'll probably see a presentation about that by Dr. Anselm Smolka after my presentation, is quite important, but it is very small, the insurance penetration in several countries. We can see here on this map that in a lot of the countries, it's still relatively low. And one of the reasons is because often insurance is quite expensive, but it can be quite expensive if we do not know much about the risk. Once we develop these models about risk assessment, we know more about the risk, so it might be possible for us to develop specific products which might be more interesting for the local users. And I'm showing here how insurance penetration is quite small, quite low for some of the countries. And here I'm showing actually a study that was done for Turkey many years ago, almost 2 decades ago, but it was based on some of the results from this study that then the Turkish insurance catastrophe pool was developed. So in this study, basically, we try to understand what are the average general losses that we should expect? What are the losses for different return periods and for specific earthquakes that we can expect? And then based on those, on that information, we can transfer the risk from the public sector, from the governments, to the international insurance and reinsurance market. If we go a little bit more in detail, I just wanted also to give this very nice example of a study that was done in Switzerland for schools. And we just had a presentation about schools as well in Nepal. This example here in particular is for Switzerland, but in this specific case, this was quite useful to understand what are the schools that have a higher risk, a higher probability of damage, of suffering losses, and then based on that list of schools, we can start putting some priority about which schools should be retrofitted and which schools maybe don't need retrofitting or a lower level of retrofitting. So we can also use this type of risk assessment to prioritize assets for retrofitting or for other risk reduction measures. And finally, this is just the last example that I wanted to show, and I really needed to show this because of the times that we're living in now. We can also combine risk assessment studies with other types of hazards. It could be, for example, floods, it could be other natural hazards, but it also could also be the risk from pandemics. For example, for this specific case that I'm showing here, more than a year ago, we got a request from the Italian Civil Protection about what if an earthquake happens during the pandemic? And this was relatively early stages in the pandemic, was probably five months after the declaration of the pandemic from the World Health Organization. But from that information, we start developing models to understand if the safety measures collapse, because basically people will not be able to follow the safety measures, or we're going to have a huge accumulation of people in hospitals. How do we expect the number of cases to increase or decrease? And what are going to be the additional fatalities due to an event during the pandemic? So this was also quite important, and this was also provided to several international organizations to develop preparedness plans. So with this, I just wanted to show a few examples of how risk information can be used, and it has been used for decades now, maybe a little bit more frequent in the last years, but how risk information can be used to develop or to support risk management. And now I wanted to show what are the components that we need to develop these results, to come up with these results, and how the global earthquake model, in collaboration with many of our partners, are contributing to this problem. So starting with the basic part, with the earthquake hazard, the assessment of earthquake hazard. And with this component, we're trying to respond to questions like, where earthquakes are going to happen, how frequent are the earthquakes going to be, what are the expected magnitude of those events. So that's the type of information we're trying to answer. Usually we can have two big types of assessment, either earthquake scenarios. So basically we consider just a single event and the impact of just single events, or we do what we call probabilistic seismic hazard. And this is basically when we consider all the possible events that can happen in a given region, obviously with the associated magnitude and frequency. We know that earthquakes, very strong earthquakes, don't happen as often as earthquakes with lower magnitude. And here I'm showing just two examples of an event, a scenario very similar to the Armenia earthquake in Colombia in 1999. And then on the right, we have the probabilistic seismic hazard map for Colombia. And these are the types of results that we use, for example, to develop design regulations, which are one of the main instruments to reduce earthquake risk worldwide. So at GEM, we have developed this open source tool that can help users to develop this earthquake scenario. So basically just a single event. Let's calculate how much is the expected shaking in a region. And we have also developed the capability of estimating what we call hazard maps. So the expected shaking for a given level of frequency. And these are the maps that as I mentioned before, that we can use for design regulations. At the global scale, there are some regions which have some national models, but GEM worked for 4 years between 2014 and 2018 to develop this global seismic hazard map, this mosaic of seismic hazard models. And the idea was to try to come up with a uniform seismic hazard and model at the global scale, basically to perhaps not to replace, but to complement a global seismic hazard map that existed already since 1999, the well-known GSHAP. And what we have here in the region is basically how the world was divided in different tiles, different regions, and the models. These are 30 models globally, and they comprise this global seismic hazard model. Obviously, we understand that several countries have their national models, such as the case of Ecuador, such as the case of many other countries in the world. But this is the mosaic that was used. But obviously, none of these models replace the national models that exist in some other countries. So with these models, we can basically now replicate, we can generate many years of seismicity. And this is what you see here. So basically, we can use this model and we can start now generating events. So we can have many years where we have no events in a particular region, but then we can have a year where we have large magnitude events that can cause losses, okay? And then we can use either a methodology called classical probabilistic seismic hazard analysis, and we can develop, for example, what we called probabilistic seismic hazard map. What we see here is the seismic hazard map at the global scale for the 475 years return period. This is, again, the same type of map that is often used for design regulations in different countries or to calculate earthquake risk, such the maps that I will show in a few minutes. So let's now go to another component to the exposure. Until now, we've seen only what is seismic risk, different ways that seismic risk can be used. And to calculate seismic risk, we need seismic hazard. But in order for us to have risk, we need to have assets. We need to have people, population, we need to have buildings, we need to have infrastructure exposed to earthquakes. And this is where this takes us to the next topic, the exposure modeling. So exposure modeling can be done in many ways. And you might think that is a relatively simple component because you can see the buildings, right? We can go to the buildings and we can start collecting information using some of the tools that, for example, GEM developed an app for Android mobile devices that you can go building by building and collect information. And for example, let me show you here just this example. What you see here is the exposure collection that was performed in the small town called Pavia in Italy, where GEM is located, where we had about 40 students that in one afternoon, they went into the streets with these devices and they collected building by building information. Okay, and then basically all the students can come back to class They can all give their databases, the data that was collected. This can be merged into a single database, and then we can perform seismic risk analysis. The advantage of doing something like this is that the information is very detailed. We can capture all the particularities of the different buildings. However, this was possible to do because we had 40 engineers ready to go into the field and collect information. And Pavia, as I said, it's a relatively small town. This part that you see here represents 1,300 buildings. But if you want to do something at the larger scale, then this becomes a little bit more complicated. It requires too many resources. But some cities already have what we call cadastral data sets. For example, what you see here, it's a cadastral data set for the capital of Croatia in Zagreb. It doesn't have all the information that we need to perform seismic risk analysis, but it has the location of the buildings, it has the menus, it has a number of stories, and all that information is extremely useful. It doesn't have, however, information such as the main material of construction, which is extremely important, or the date of construction, which is also quite important because of design regulations. So this is also something that needs to be complemented with additional information. But it also represents another way that we can obtain exposure information for risk analysis. The other example that I wanted to show, and it's interesting because we just saw a presentation about the great work that is performed in Kathmandu, and I'm showing here Kathmandu. It's what we call OpenStreetMap. It's basically an editable map of the world. It doesn't have full coverage everywhere in the world. It does have a good coverage in certain parts of Kathmandu because of the events that happened in the recent past. But basically, this is an editable map of the world where people can come, they can contribute with their own information, and this is also publicly available to everybody. And in some parts of the world, as I said, Kathmandu, but also in various cities of the world, this type of information can also be used for risk analysis. And OpenStreetMap is growing exponentially. So we hope that in the future, all the buildings in the world are going to be cataloged in this initiative. Finally, if we want to go more at the national scale, and this is extremely important because there's a lot of activities that we have to do at the national scale, we can also use some of this information that is collected at the national scale, like housing census information, or some of the surveys and databases about the commercial and industrial facilities. And this is something that we did at the global scale, with a stronger focus, of course, in countries where seismic hazard is quite relevant. So we collected housing and population data, we launched national housing surveys, we organized meetings in several parts, for example, in Latin America, but also in other parts of the world. And from time to time, we also use satellite data in order to improve the spatial resolution of some of these models. We see, for example, over there, the example for 80. Let me just show you, to spend a little bit of time in a particular case of South America. We had this project that was supported by the Swiss Re Foundation, and in this project involved several institutions in South America. It ended already more than 5 years ago, but the data is obviously available for anybody to use. But we invited people from the different institutions to participate in the events that took place, for example, in Medellin, in Bogota, also in Santiago. And in these events, basically different experts shared their opinion, they contributed with data, they corrected some of the models, some of the data sets that existed. And with that information, it was possible to develop also an exposure model that covers all South America. So basically, this exposure model contains information about all the residential, commercial, and industrial buildings at the smallest available administrative level. That sometimes, unfortunately, it's not very detailed, but it is what was available. And the particular case of South America is quite interesting because there's a huge concentration of population, of capital stock, of goods in cities. So for example, 50% of the population is concentrated in 10 cities. If we consider only the Andean countries, and if we exclude Brazil. And we can see that in a lot of these cities, like for example, Guayaquil, also Quito, Lima, there's high seismic hazard. So obviously those are cities where additional attention needs to be devoted. I just wanted to finish this part about the development of exposure models to say that the data is quite important and is quite useful, but we really need to listen to the experts, because there's always a lot of flaws, a lot of limitations in that data, a lot of stuff that is simply not captured on the data sets. So we try as much as possible to organize workshops, usually several days, where we share the data and we discuss some of the results. And these are the places where we organized this type of events at the global scale. And despite the fact that, for example, I'm showing here Santiago, Lima, Quito, Bogota, Medellin, I would like to note that in some of these events, like for example in Medellin, people from other countries are also invited. Like for example, colleagues from Venezuela were also invited, and this is usually quite important, again, to make sure that we also exchange some ideas with experts from other countries. So once this process is complete, this is more or less the type of information that is collected for the different countries. I'm showing here just the example for Costa Rica, a country that had a lot of information, detailed information available. So we have the residential building stock, the non-residential, which is usually commercial and industrial buildings. We have the value of the buildings, the building classes, the number of occupants, and this type of information is very useful for earthquake risk. But this information can also be used for other natural hazards, like, for example, floods, hurricanes, storms, wildfires, and even for hazards which are not natural, like, for example, man-made hazards like terrorism or explosions. We repeat this, as I said, for all the countries around the world, and we get to something like this, a global exposure model. What you see here is the number of buildings on an evenly spaced grid, and this is more or less how it looks. Now, if we start overlaying the exposure with the seismic hazard map that I showed before, this can bring some interesting information. So, for example, let's now consider how many people do we have exposed to different levels of seismic hazard, okay? And I put over there Quito because it has relatively high seismic hazard compared to other parts of the world. Let's try to understand what is the proportion of population that we have exposed to different levels of seismic hazard. For example, let's consider a very low seismic hazard, only 0.05 G. This level of seismic hazard, it's usually not capable of causing significant damage in buildings. But if an earthquake happens and we have this level of acceleration in a given location, we will feel the earthquake. So this is a perceivable level of seismic hazard. It might not be sufficient to cause significant damage, but people will feel that this event happened. And for this level of seismic hazard, which I repeat is quite low, 68% of the population is exposed to it. So more than half of the world population is exposed to a level of seismic hazard of 0.05 G. If we increase this level of seismic hazard, let's say that we now go to 0.1 G. Now we have 42% of the population is exposed to this level of seismic hazard. And this is already sufficiently high to cause damage in buildings. So it is critical to make sure that design regulations are followed for this level of seismic hazard. If we increase the seismic hazard even more, let's now go to a level of seismic hazard that can cause damage even in buildings that were well designed. Then we have 1/4 of the world is exposed to this level of seismic hazard. So it's a lot of people, 25%, more or less 25% of the world population is exposed to quite high levels of seismic hazard, like the west of all South America, Central America, west of the United States, and then a part that I wanted to show, the Ring of Fire, okay? So what I'm showing here is basically just an overlap of the exposure with the seismic hazard model that I presented previously. So if you see warmer colors, it means that the seismic hazard is relatively high. And if the polygon is quite high, it means that we have a lot of buildings at that particular location. So if you have an animation of this, and I will show in a second also the case for South America, including Ecuador, we can see that we have New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, the Philippines, and then obviously Nepal, the Himalayan belt over there, and also Japan, of regions of very high concentration of population of buildings, but also high or moderate seismic hazard. If we see now the example for South America, There's no news here, but basically we have a huge concentration of population in cities such as Santiago, Lima, Quito, Bogota, so the capitals, where we have a huge concentration of exposure, but also extremely high seismic hazard. So obviously places where we should do additional studies and hopefully make sure that they're not just studies, that those results from those studies are used to inform risk management solutions. So now I wanted to bring the last component of the seismic risk. So we already talked about the seismic hazard, which is only the geophysical phenomena. It only means if there's shaking in a given region. Then we talk about assets, about exposure, which basically only means if we have buildings in a given location. This last component is telling us, okay, I know that I have a building here and I know the seismic hazard, but what's the likelihood of that building to suffer damage? Okay, so that's why what we call the vulnerability assessment. So if we start with very low seismic hazard, we know that we shouldn't have damage, but as the seismic intensity increases, we might have slight damage, moderate damage, extensive damage, and unfortunately, we might have collapse. This is just an example for massive buildings. And here we have just an example for reinforced concrete buildings. So the seismic vulnerability, as I mentioned before, will be influenced, for example, by the design regulations. If we have an old building with no seismic provisions, we don't know that even for low levels of shaking, we will have some significant damage. And if we have buildings that were designed following a modern design regulation and designed and built recently, then we shouldn't expect a lot of damage on those buildings. So that's what we mean by seismic vulnerability. Let me show here just an example of what is this fragility and vulnerability functions. So on the left, we have here a fragility function. So we can see that as the acceleration from the ground caused by the earthquake increases, so does the probability that my building is going to collapse. And after a certain level of acceleration, I have basically 100% probability that my building is going to collapse. We have here for the collapse, for the complete damage, but also extensive, moderate, and slight damage. We can see that, for example, for this particular type of building, one-story reinforced concrete building, after 1G, 100% of the buildings in the region will have at least slight damage, and we have already buildings collapsing. This is fragility, this is about damage, but as I mentioned before, we can convert this into economic losses or into human losses. So let's now bring all the pieces together. So we start with our seismic hazard model, and with that seismic hazard model, we can start generating many events. For example, here's 50 years worth of events that were generated using this mosaic of 30 seismic hazard models that I presented previously. Now I will use the example of Costa Rica just to show how this process is performed. So I have the country of Costa Rica. This is one of the events that was generated. So we have here a magnitude 8.1. We can see the finiteness of the fault over there. With that event generated ground shaking in the region, we can see that closer to the fault, we have higher shaking. And then as we get further away, closer to the Caribbean, now we don't have, we have lower shaking. We bring the exposure. And for the particular case of Costa Rica, there's a huge concentration of buildings around San Jose, the capital, in the middle of the country. We bring also our vulnerability functions, and we estimate our economic losses. So for this particular event, these are the losses that will be generated in Costa Rica. Now we do the same thing for many more events and more events and more events and more events, and we can start calculating some very important risk metrics. For example, average annualized losses. So if we could sum the losses for the next 1,000 years, and if we could divide that by 1,000 years, we would have on average the losses that we expect every year on the different regions. We have here the annual economic and human losses for the residential building stock. Then we have also the economic losses for the non-residential buildings, so commercial and industrial facilities. We also have the losses for different return periods on the bottom. And then we also have disaggregation of losses across the different sectors. This was also repeated for all the countries in South America, following different levels of resolution. I'm showing here the losses at the first administrative level. And then these losses were also disaggregated on an evenly spaced grid at the global scale to produce what we call the Uniform Global Seismic Risk Map. And this was released in 2018. It is quite important to have these losses, this process of calculating risk following this uniform approach, because now we can understand what are the drivers of risk. Is it the seismic hazard? Is it the exposure? Is it the vulnerability? Is it all of the above? And what can we do to reduce the risk? It is also quite important for us to follow a uniform approach to calculate the risk, because this way I can compare the risk between different countries, and I can also compare the risk between different regions, for example, inside of Ecuador, and start understanding if the model makes sense. And if so, then perhaps the risk metrics are reliable and I can use them in risk management. I also wanted to show some additional metrics about this global model. So for example, 80% of the losses at the global scale come only from 15 countries. And we have obviously Japan, China, and USA, extremely big countries exposed to high seismic hazard. But we also have countries from South America, like Ecuador over there, Colombia, and Chile. So obviously extremely important to take all of this into account. And South America, there's definitely significant risk comparable to other countries. In the results I'm showing here, we're obviously taking into account the fact that building in Japan, building in the United States, building in Italy, it's more expensive than building, for example, in the Philippines. But if we normalize everything by the construction cost by the square meter, then we have these results. So now we have China, Iran, Japan on the top, but we also have some new countries in this list, like, for example, Peru now appears over there, and also Guatemala, but we still have Ecuador here on the list of the top 15 countries in terms of seismic hazard and seismic risk in the world. Just to finish, I also wanted to show some ways in which this seismic hazard and seismic risk models are being used worldwide. So the model, as I mentioned, was released in 2018. And in the first year, the maps, the models, the documentation was downloaded and accessed more than 10,000 times. So it does show that there is a need and an interest from the global community for information about risk information. Probably even more important than these results, and I mentioned this before, is the fact that these models do not replace national models. They do not replace local models, but they can support the development of some of these models. And for example, we've seen in Canada that different components of this model have been further improved. And that's the example we see here. This is for Vancouver. So basically, some of the ingredients from this global model are being further improved and used at the local level. We also contributed to the Global Assessment Report of the United Nations. So information about the distribution of losses and seismic hazard at the global scale was included in that report, which is an extremely important tool for some governments. We're also porting parts of this model into commercial platforms in a way to try to improve the insurance penetration in some countries, like, for example, in South Africa. As I said before, we also worked on the combination between earthquakes and the possible increase in COVID-19 cases. And this is now included in the World Health Organization library of relevant information. And we've been using these components of this model for capacity development, and more specifically within this track project, which has a lot of people from Ecuador involved. To finish, I just wanted to mention that we are organizing what we call the track webinar. So it's this project that I know a lot of you, some of you have been involved, but I wanted to invite anybody to participate in this webinar. This is going to be about risk assessment and hazard assessment, mostly in the Caribbean, but also with a strong focus on capacity building anywhere in the world. And if you're interested, please sign up for this track webinar. I'm putting here the website, or you can just go to the Global Earthquake Model website to find additional information about this webinar. And some very relevant information on this webinar is going to be presented for Ecuador and in particular Quito. So I welcome all of you to participate. And with that, thank you very much for the invitation. I think you are on mute.
Sorry. Thank you so much for your presentation. And maybe we can stop sharing your screen. Thank you so much. So we have some questions from our audience. For example, here I have, what are the open questions, the questions for the future related to earthquake risk assessment? What's going to be in the near future in risk assessment?
That's an excellent question. So I think what I presented here is just the tip of the iceberg. There's still a lot to be done. So just to give you an example of how limited is the model that I just presented, we only covered residential, commercial, and industrial buildings, but we're still missing the schools, the hospitals, transportation system, government buildings. So all those assets obviously have to be included on the risk assessment. So this is a very incomplete view of the risk, and I wanted to emphasize that. Also, something that is quite important to mention is that the economic and human losses that we have computed so far are only due to ground shaking, so the shaking caused by earthquakes. But we also have secondary hazards, like, for example, liquefaction, landslides, tsunamis, fire following, which are also extremely important, and right now are not being covered by this model. So I also wanted to mention that. Finally, if I may, I also wanted to mention that for some countries, like for example in Japan, the direct losses are not the big problem. It is often the indirect losses, the fact that some businesses are going to be closed. And as we've seen again after the Tohoku earthquake, in the world that we live now, that everything is connected, the fact that we have some business interruption, the disruption of economic activities in Japan can affect other parts of the world because of the way that now the industry trains are connected. So indirect losses due to business interruption are also not being considered by this model that I just presented. So in my opinion, I think we need to now expand the model in terms of the assets, in terms of the types of losses, and also in terms of the secondary hazards.
Thank you so much. Sorry, again. Here I have another interesting question. You are the Seismic Risk Coordinator at the Global Earthquake Model GIM Foundation. What are the scopes of the GIM Foundation?
What are the scopes? Yes, so yes, I'm the director of the, I'm the risk coordinator, but there's also obviously a very important team that deals with the seismic hazard. So obviously part of GEM deals with the seismic hazard, so developing seismic hazard models, developing hazard modeling tools, and obviously doing a lot of work that is necessary, for example, for the design regulations that I was mentioning before, which is seismic hazard map is one of the main ingredients for the seismic hazard analysis. All this information that I showed, all the results that I showed require tools and very efficient tools. So we also have a group of people, of IT developers, which are developing platforms, tools, open tools, obviously the website. So making sure that all this science, all these resources can be accessible by others and can also support the users, which are currently using some of the tools and some of the models that we have being produced by GEM. Finally, I just wanted to mention that socioeconomic vulnerability is obviously extremely important, and it's something that I didn't mention in my presentation because there's no time, but GEM has also developed databases and models of socioeconomic vulnerability, which should be taken into account to make sure that if we have the same loss between two different countries, we know that the impact, the long-term impact, it's not going to be the same. So that's when the socioeconomic vulnerability needs to be brought in to make this distinguish. You're in mute again. Sorry.
Está cerrado el micrófono, Pablo.
Oh, and you're mute again. Sorry, I think you unmuted yourself. Okay, now it's good.
Yes, it's something related with my mouse. No, it's okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was
Thank you, Pablo.
Really new ideas, really encouraging ideas of working together with many people, with many instruments, with many scientifics, with people from all over the world. Thank you so much. So
Muchas
now,
gracias.